Fidel Castro died over the weekend, and Johnny was talking about how you know, kind of sad it was to see people just celebrating the death of somebody. Well, you know, Fidel Castro is a real mixed bag. I mean, the guy was an absolute autocrat, and you know, ruled Cuba in a way that did not allow for dissent on the one hand. So if you wanted to have political freedom and you disagreed with Castro's version of that, then you could be in deep trouble and you could be in prison. On the other hand, the people who really weren't all that concerned about, quote, political freedom, end quote, were very happy to have free medical care and discounted housing and, you know, widely available food. Although certainly there have been a lot of shortages and a lot of problems over the years, in large part because of the American embargo. So I view it just as a complete mixed bag. I don't see Castro as all evil or all good, but I can recognize both in his rule. And Raul has moved Cuba in the direction of a free market economy. He's moving it slowly and carefully, which I think is wise. And you know, not much to complain about there. It's you know, he's moving in the right direction. But the thing that was completely missing, I heard a whole thing on NPR this morning, or maybe it was yesterday morning, about you know, Nixon in '59 and how, you know, Cuba, you know, Batista was basically a right-wing dictator who was owned by the mafia and was supported by the American administration. Richard Nixon was vice president of the United States, and he was owned by the mafia. And he was in charge of the Cuba desk. You know, Dwight Eisenhower put him in charge of Cuba. And so Nixon's plan for 1960 was an October surprise. It was, you know, the election was held in November of 1960 between Vice President Nixon and Senator John Kennedy. And Nixon wanted to take out Castro in October so that he could take credit for that and say, yeah, I got rid of Castro. And, you know, so Nixon was responsible for Castro going to Cuba in the first, or going to the Soviet Union in the first place, because Castro, after he overthrew Batista, the first thing he did was reach out to the United States. I mean, this is a guy who came to the United States and tried out for the New York Yankees. It's not like he hates us or hated us. He reached out to the United States, and Nixon slapped him away and said, no, we're not going to collaborate with you. We're not going to embrace you because you, see, Nixon was really upset that his guy, you know, Bibi Rebozo, his mob benefactor who he shared a home with down in Florida and all this kind of stuff, you know, Bibi and a whole bunch of other Cuban expats were you know, very upset that the mob was basically being thrown out of Cuba by Castro, who was a good government guy in the beginning. And so when Castro came to Nixon and said, hey, you know, let me join up with the U.S. I'm going to do good government down here. I'm going to get rid of the mob. Nixon was totally mobbed up, and he said, no, screw you. And so Castro turned to the Soviet Union and said, will you help me out? And, of course, Khrushchev was like, yeah, New York minute. And so then Kennedy starts beating on Nixon for letting Cuba go communist, which was justified. And by the way, Kennedy was then using that to get elected in 1960. And there's those who would argue, and I'm among them, that that was one of the main things that helped him get elected in 1960. But in the midst of that, Nixon put together what was going to be an October surprise, what was going to be an invasion of Cuba in October of 1960, you know, the month before the election. And he wasn't able to make it happen. He couldn't pull it off. But he had all these thousands of Cuban expats down in Florida at the so-called University of Miami, which was the CIA headquarters down there, ready to invade Cuba. JFK inherited this and didn't even know it until, you know, a year and a half into his administration when it was time to pull the trigger. Well, the guy who was talking to NPR didn't even mention the fact that this was all Nixon's idea, that Nixon did this as an October surprise, that the Bay of Pigs, you know, you could lay the whole thing at the feet of Nixon. And the Castro, you know, if you were a political activist in Cuba, Castro was a real problem. Castro was an absolute tyrant when it came to political dissent. He did not allow it. On the other hand, Castro made sure that the people of Cuba had good medical care, good housing, good food. I mean, you know, it's so you've got to, I mean, there are people in Cuba who are celebrating the death of Castro. There are people in Cuba who are mourning the death of Castro. And they tend to be on the two sides of that basically political divide. And our media is just really doing a pathetic job of character. You know, they keep going to Miami, to little Cuba in Miami, because it's cheap and easy, right, to send a correspondent there and say, well, what do you think? And then they go to Andrea Mitchell in Cuba, and she tries to give a more nuanced view, and it's like, oh, well, you know, let's move along. Somebody complaining about Castro. Really? But Castro, the modern-day Castro, was the creation of Richard Nixon. And, you know, Lamar Waldron wrote a whole book about this. His book on Watergate goes back into that. Well, frankly, you know, the books that he and I wrote, Legacy of Secrecy and Ultimate Sacrifice, talk about this. And the books about the assassination of John Kennedy. So it's not, you know, and we're not the only ones who've written about it. I mean, you know, serious historians, there's entire books that have been written about it. Not like it's some kind of secret, but the media just never wants to talk about it because, once again, it was Republican perfidy. It was the Republican Vice President Nixon trying to swing the 1960 election by committing the same kind of treason that he successfully committed in 1968 when he blew up the Paris peace talks with South Vietnam, and told them, if you don't give LBJ his victory, you know, or his peace deal, you wait, I'll give you a better deal and I'll make you rich. And so they said, okay, that's it. We're not going to end the Vietnam War. They were willing to end the Vietnam War in October of 1968. And that was going to be Lyndon Johnson's October surprise that was going to get his vice president, Hubert Humphrey, elected. And Nixon blew it up. And of course, you've heard on this show, LBJ calling up Everett Dirksen and saying, Everett, this is treason. And Dirksen says, I know. I'm going to try and do something about it, but I don't know if I can. Richard Nixon doesn't listen.